The machine gun nest erupted in a devastating symphony of death, its metallic staccato cutting through the morning air like a scythe through wheat. Private William Thompson felt the bullets whistle past his helmet as he pressed his face deeper into the blood-soaked earth of France. It was June 6, 1918, and the world was about to witness the transformation of the United States Marine Corps from a small naval force into a legendary fighting machine. Just 48 hours earlier, the German spring offensive had shattered Allied lines along the Marne River. General Erich von Ludendorff's forces had launched their most desperate gambit to win the Great War. Before American reinforcements could tip the balance, the German Fourth Army, comprised of battle-hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, had smashed through French defenses with ruthless efficiency. Now they stood poised to capture the vital road junction at Château-Thierry. A mere 50 miles from Paris, the French High Command was in chaos. General Philippe Petain's exhausted divisions were retreating in disarray, their morale shattered by 3 years of unprecedented carnage. Into this maelstrom stepped the American Expeditionary Force, green but determined, carrying the hopes of a nation that had only recently awakened to the reality of total war. The 2nd Division of the American Expeditionary Force had been hastily assembled for this critical moment, under the command of Major General Omar Bundy. It consisted of 2 infantry brigades and supporting elements. The 3rd Brigade comprised regular Army units, while the 4th Brigade was entirely composed of United States Marines. This Marine Brigade, led by Brigadier General James Harbord, contained the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments, along with the 6th Machine Gun Battalion. These Marines were no ordinary soldiers. They had been forged in the crucible of America's small wars, from the Philippines to Nicaragua, from Cuba to Haiti. Their ranks included men like Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Daly, already a legend with 2 Medals of Honor to his name, and First Sergeant John Quick, whose courage under fire had become the stuff of Marine Corps lore. They were professionals in an army of citizen soldiers, and they carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who had seen combat in the far corners of the world. The orders came down through the chain of command with stark simplicity. Halt the German advance at all costs. The Marines would take their positions along a line running from the village of Lucy-le-Bocage to the ancient hunting preserve known as Belleau Wood. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans had occupied the wood with elements of the 4th Guards Division, among the Kaiser's finest troops. What the intelligence failed to convey was the sheer tactical nightmare that awaited the Marines. Belleau Wood stretched across nearly 1 square mile of dense forest, its ancient trees providing perfect concealment for machine gun nests and sniper positions. The Germans had spent weeks preparing their defenses, creating interlocking fields of fire that could cut down attacking infantry. With methodical precision, over 2,000 German soldiers and 30 machine guns were positioned within the wood, their commanders confident that no force on earth could dislodge them from their prepared positions. As dawn broke on June 6th, the Marines received their final briefings. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. They would advance across 600 yards of open wheat field, under full view of German observers, to assault the most heavily fortified position on the Western Front. By every tactical measure of the time, they should have been annihilated before reaching the tree line. According to the Marine Corps University's historical documentation, the conditions facing the Marines were described as tactically impossible by contemporary military standards. But history would remember this day not for what should have happened, but for what did. The Marines of the 4th Brigade were about to write their names in blood and fire across the pages of military history, transforming themselves from a small expeditionary force into one of the world's most feared fighting units. The whistle shrieked across the wheat field like a banshee's wail, and 3,000 Marines rose as one from their shallow trenches. The morning sun cast long shadows across the golden stalks as the men of the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments began their march toward immortality. Captain John Thomason of the 5th Marines later wrote that the sight reminded him of a parade ground drill, if parade grounds were swept by machine gun fire and carpeted with the dead. Floyd Gibbons, war correspondent for the Chicago Tribune, had positioned himself against explicit orders with the attacking Marines. As bullets began to whistle overhead, he scribbled frantically in his notebook, unaware that his dispatches would soon make the name Marine synonymous with heroism across America. The journalist had argued his way to the front lines, ignoring pleas from officers to remain in the rear with other correspondents. His decision would cost him an eye but would immortalize the Marines in the American consciousness. The German machine gunners in Belleau Wood had been waiting for this moment. They had registered their weapons on every approach, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the wheat field into a killing ground. As the Marines advanced in disciplined lines, the Maxim guns opened up with devastating effect. The characteristic sound of German machine guns, a sound Marines would later describe as like tearing canvas, filled the air as streams of bullets swept across the advancing ranks. Private First Class Carl Brannan watched in horror as entire sections of men simply vanished in the hail of lead. The Marines had trained for this moment, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of modern warfare. Unlike their European counterparts, who had learned to advance in small rushes from cover to cover, the Americans initially employed pre-war tactics that proved suicidal against entrenched machine guns. It was then that Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Daly made his legendary stand. Seeing his men waver under the devastating fire, the veteran Marine leaped from his position and shouted the words that would echo through Marine Corps' history. "Come on, you sons of bitches. Do you want to live forever?" His fierce cry galvanized the Marines around him, and they surged forward with renewed determination. The first wave reached the edge of Belleau Wood just as the German artillery began to fall. The enemy had anticipated the Marine assault and had pre-registered their guns on likely assembly areas. High explosive shells erupted among the trees, sending splinters of wood and metal sifting through the air. The Marines who had survived the machine gun gauntlet now faced a new horror, as the forest itself seemed to explode around them. Combat in Belleau Wood was unlike anything the Marines had experienced. The dense undergrowth and rocky terrain broke up formations and reduced the battle to a series of individual encounters between small groups of men. German snipers, hidden in the canopy above, picked off Marines with methodical precision. Every fallen log might conceal a machine gun nest. Every thicket might hide a squad of German infantry. The Marines adapted with the flexibility that would become their trademark. They learned to use the terrain to their advantage, employing small unit tactics that had never been taught in their training manuals. Sergeant Major John Quick organized his men into fire teams, a tactical innovation that would later become standard throughout the Marine Corps. Each team would provide covering fire while another advanced, leapfrogging through the forest in a deadly game of cat and mouse. By nightfall on June 6th, the Marines had gained a foothold in the southern edge of Belleau Wood, but at a terrible cost. The 4th Marine Brigade had suffered over 1,000 casualties on the first day alone, more than the entire Marine Corps had sustained in its previous 142 years of existence. The wheat field behind them was carpeted with the bodies of young Americans who had learned too late that modern warfare showed no mercy to courage alone. Floyd Gibbons, now wearing a blood-soaked bandage over his ruined eye, filed his dispatch from a field hospital behind the lines. His vivid prose would soon appear in newspapers across America, describing the Marines' heroic assault and coining phrases that would become part of American military legend. Unknown to the wounded correspondent, his words were already transforming public perception of the Marine Corps from a small naval force into something far greater. The first day of Belleau Wood had ended in tactical stalemate, but something profound had changed. The Marines had proven they could stand against the Kaiser's finest troops and hold their ground. As darkness fell over the blood-soaked forest, both sides prepared for the brutal weeks that lay ahead. Dawn on June 7th brought no respite to the Marines, clinging to their precarious positions in Belleau Wood. The forest had become a charnel house where death lurked behind every tree, and silence was more terrifying than the sound of gunfire. Major Thomas Holcomb, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 6th Marines, surveyed the hellish landscape through his field glasses and wondered if any force on earth could take this position. The Germans had turned the wood into a fortress that would have impressed medieval engineers. Machine gun nests were positioned, to provide interlocking fields of fire along every trail and clearing. Snipers had established positions in the thick canopy, their rifle barrels carefully camouflaged. Among the branches, most deadly of all were the concealed mortar positions that could rain death upon any Marine formation that attempted to advance. Captain Donald Duncan of the 6th Marines led his company in the first assault of the day. Moving through the undergrowth, with the stealth of hunters, the forest floor was thick with fallen leaves that muffled footsteps, but also concealed tripwires connected to explosive devices. Every step forward was a gamble with death. Every sound might bring a burst of machine gun fire or the whistle of an incoming mortar round. The battle for Belleau Wood had evolved into a new form of warfare that none of the combatants had experienced before. Unlike the trench warfare that had characterized the Western Front, fighting in the forest was intensely personal. Marines found themselves in hand-to-hand combat with German soldiers, using bayonets, trench knives, and even fists to settle disputes that artillery and machine guns could not resolve. Corporal John Kelly became a legend during these desperate days, single-handedly assaulting a German machine gun position that had pinned down his entire platoon. Armed only with a rifle and a handful of grenades, Kelly crawled through the underbrush for over an hour, dodging sniper fire and mortar fragments. When he finally reached the enemy position, he eliminated the entire crew with grenades and rifle fire, then turned the captured weapon on other German positions. His actions would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, they demonstrated the individual initiative that was becoming the hallmark of Marine Corps' tactics. The psychological strain of combat in Belleau Wood was unprecedented. Men who had proven their courage in conventional battles found themselves pushed to the breaking point by the constant threat of invisible death. The forest seemed to swallow sound, creating an eerie silence that was broken only by the crack of sniper rifles or the scream of wounded men. Many Marines later reported that they could feel the eyes of German soldiers, watching them from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. First Sergeant John Quick, veteran of conflicts from the Philippines to Nicaragua, had never encountered anything like the tactical challenges of Belleau Wood. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, appearing only long enough to fire a few shots before melting back into the forest. Traditional military formations were useless in this environment, and Quick found himself improvising new tactics on the fly. The Marines began to adapt their fighting style to the unique conditions of forest warfare. They learned to move in small groups, maintaining contact through hand signals and whispered commands. Each Marine became responsible for watching a specific sector, creating a web of observation that was difficult for German infiltrators to penetrate. Most importantly, they developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between natural forest sounds and those made by human movement. Private Albert Smith wrote in his diary, "We have become ghosts in this haunted wood, moving through shadows and striking without warning. The Germans are skilled fighters, but they have never faced Marines who have learned to make the forest their ally, rather than their enemy." Reference to this context is taken from the Marine Corps University's historical archives, documenting personal accounts from Belleau Wood veterans. The battle was far from over, but the Marines were proving that they could match the Germans' tactical skill with their own innovations. As the second day of fighting drew to a close, neither side had gained a decisive advantage. The forest remained contested ground, with both armies locked in a deadly embrace that would test the limits of human endurance. By the end of June 7th, the Marines had learned harsh lessons about modern warfare, but they had also discovered something about themselves. They possessed a flexibility and fighting spirit that could adapt to any battlefield condition. The forest of Belleau Wood was forging them into something new, a force that would become the stuff of legend. The third week of June brought torrential rain to the Belleau Wood sector, turning the forest floor into a muddy quagmire that clung to everything like a living thing. The Marines, exhausted from 2 weeks of constant fighting, found themselves battling not only the Germans, but also the elements themselves. Water filled their foxholes, rusted their weapons, and made every movement a struggle against the sucking mud. Major John Hughes, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 6th Marines, studied the situation mapped with growing frustration. His men had fought with unprecedented courage, but the German defenders showed no sign of breaking. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy had been reinforced with fresh troops from the reserve divisions, bringing their total strength in the wood to nearly 3,000 men. The Marines had learned to fight like their Native American ancestors, using stealth and cunning to overcome superior numbers and firepower. Sergeant Joseph Erskine led a patrol deep into German-held territory, moving through the forest with the silence of hunting wolves. His mission was to locate and destroy a German observation post that had been directing devastating artillery fire on Marine positions. The patrol moved through the pre-dawn darkness, each man acutely aware that a single misstep could alert the enemy to their presence. The forest seemed alive with hostile eyes, and every shadow might conceal a German sentry. Erskine's men had blackened their faces with mud and wrapped their equipment in cloth to eliminate any metallic sounds that might give away their position. Combat in Belleau would have become a test of individual character as much as military skill. Marines found themselves alone in the darkness, forced to make life and death decisions without the guidance of officers or the support of their comrades. The forest stripped away all pretense and revealed the true nature of each man's courage. Private William Francis discovered this truth when he found himself cut off from his squad during a German counterattack. Surrounded by enemy soldiers and with ammunition running low, he had to choose between surrender and a fighting retreat through hostile territory. Francis chose to fight, using his knowledge of the forest to evade German patrols while making his way back to Marine lines. His 3-day odyssey through enemy territory would later become the stuff of Marine Corps' legend. The Germans, meanwhile, were proving to be formidable opponents who had learned from their own mistakes. They had abandoned their initial defensive strategy of holding fixed positions and had adopted a more flexible approach that emphasized mobility and surprise. German infiltration teams would appear behind Marine lines, create havoc, then disappear into the forest before reinforcements could respond. Captain Graves Erskine, commanding a company of the 5th Marines, developed innovative counter-infiltration tactics that would later influence Marine Corps' doctrine. He organized his men into overlapping defensive positions that could provide mutual support while maintaining the flexibility to respond to threats from any direction. His system of interlocking fire zones made it nearly impossible for German infiltrators to penetrate Marine positions without being detected. The psychological warfare aspect of the battle was becoming as important as the physical combat. Both sides employed techniques designed to break the enemy's morale and fighting spirit. German snipers would target Marine officers and non-commissioned officers, hoping to disrupt command and control. The Marines responded by training every man to assume leadership responsibilities, creating a resilient command structure that could function even under devastating losses. The fighting had reached a level of intensity that few military historians had ever documented. Men who had survived the initial assault were now veterans of a type of warfare that was unlike anything previously experienced in human conflict. The forest had become a laboratory for testing new tactical innovations, and both sides were learning lessons that would influence military thinking for generations to come. First Sergeant Daniel Daly, now a living legend among the Marines, continued to lead by example even as his body showed the strain of continuous combat. His uniform was torn and stained, his equipment was improvised from captured German gear, but his spirit remained unbroken. He had become the embodiment of Marine Corps' values, proving that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. As the battle entered its 3rd week, it was clear that Belleau would have become more than just a tactical objective. It had become a symbol of American determination and Marine Corps' excellence. The world was watching, and the Marines were determined not to disappoint. The morning of June 20th dawned with an ominous stillness that experienced Marines had learned to interpret as the calm before the storm. General James Harbord, commander of the 4th Marine Brigade, had received orders from division headquarters that would change the nature of the battle forever. The time for gradual advances and defensive actions had passed. The Marines were about to unleash a coordinated assault that would either break the German defenses or result in the destruction of the entire brigade. The plan was audacious in its scope and devastating in its potential consequences. 3 battalions of Marines would simultaneously attack different sectors of Belleau Wood, supported by the heaviest artillery bombardment yet seen on the Western Front. The 6th Machine Gun Battalion would provide covering fire while engineers cleared paths through the German wire obstacles. It was a gamble that would either end the battle in decisive victory or result in catastrophic failure. Major Thomas Holcomb briefed his officers with characteristic bluntness. "Gentlemen, we are about to attempt something that military theorists would consider impossible. We are going to take a fortified position that has been prepared by the enemy for over a month, defended by their best troops, and protected by terrain that favors the defender. We are going to succeed because we are Marines, and Marines do not know how to fail." The artillery preparation began at dawn, with American guns unleashing a barrage that could be heard 20 miles away. The forest seemed to explode as high explosive shells crashed among the trees, sending splinters of wood and metal sifting through the air. The bombardment was designed not only to destroy German positions, but also to demoralize the defenders and disrupt their command and control systems. Private Karl Brannan, now a veteran of 3 weeks of continuous combat, watched the artillery preparation with mixed emotions. The devastating firepower was impressive, but he knew from experience that artillery alone could not dislodge determined defenders from well-prepared positions. The final assault would still require Marines to close with the enemy and defeat them in personal combat. The attack began at precisely 0600 hours, with Marines advancing from multiple directions simultaneously. The 1st Battalion of the 6th Marines struck from the south, while the 2nd Battalion attacked from the east. The 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marines provided a supporting attack from the western approaches. The coordination required for such a complex operation was unprecedented in Marine Corps history. Sergeant Major John Quick led his men through the smoke and confusion of the initial assault, his voice carrying clearly above the sound of gunfire as he directed the advance. The Marines moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each man knowing his role in the larger plan. Years of training and weeks of combat experience had forged them into a fighting force that could function effectively under the most chaotic conditions. The German defenders, despite being stunned by the artillery bombardment, recovered quickly and began to offer fierce resistance. Machine gun nests that had survived the shelling opened fire on the advancing Marines, while snipers in the treetops picked off individual targets with deadly accuracy. The forest echoed with the sound of combat as hundreds of individual battles were fought simultaneously. Captain Donald Duncan led a charge against a German strongpoint that had been holding up the advance for over an hour. His men followed him through a hail of machine gun fire, using grenades and bayonets to clear the enemy position. Duncan himself was wounded in the assault, but continued to lead his men until the objective was secured. His actions would later earn him the Navy Cross, but more importantly, they demonstrated the leadership that had become characteristic of Marine officers. The breakthrough came when Corporal John Kelly, already a hero from earlier actions, single-handedly assaulted a German command post that was coordinating the defense of an entire sector. Using skills learned in the American frontier, Kelly infiltrated the position undetected and eliminated the entire staff with grenades and rifle fire. The loss of command and control in that sector created a gap that the Marines quickly exploited. This account draws from the Chicago Tribune's contemporary reporting by Floyd Gibbons, who witnessed many of these events firsthand despite his injuries. By noon, the Marines had achieved what military experts had considered impossible. They had broken through the German defenses and were advancing through the heart of Belleau Wood. The enemy was in full retreat, abandoning positions that they had held for weeks. The forest that had seemed impregnable was finally yielding to Marine determination and tactical skill. The victory at Belleau Wood would not be complete for several more days, but the decisive moment had passed. The Marines had proven that they could overcome any obstacle through courage, determination, and superior fighting spirit. The world was about to learn what it meant to face United States Marines in combat. The final assault on Belleau Wood began in the pre-dawn darkness of June 26th, with Marines moving through the forest like silent specters. After 20 days of brutal combat, the end was finally in sight. But both sides knew that the most dangerous moment in any battle is when victory seems assured. The Germans, desperate and cornered, would fight with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Captain Graves Erskine led the final advance of the 5th Marines, moving through terrain that had been transformed by weeks of combat into an apocalyptic landscape. Shell holes filled with stagnant water dotted the forest floor, while the trees themselves had been stripped of their branches by artillery fire. The sweet smell of rotting flesh mixed with the acrid odor of high explosives, creating an atmosphere that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Marines had learned to fight in this hellish environment with a skill that impressed even their enemies. They moved in small groups, communicating through hand signals and maintaining constant vigilance for the snipers and machine gunners who still held isolated positions throughout the wood. Every step forward was earned through blood and courage. Every yard of ground captured represented hours of desperate fighting. Sergeant Joseph Erskine, leading a patrol toward the northern edge of the wood, encountered the last major German strongpoint in a rocky outcropping that dominated the surrounding terrain. The position was defended by a company of German Marines, elite troops who had been specially trained for this type of close-quarters combat. The ensuing battle would pit the best of both armies against each other in a final test of will and skill. The combat was so intense that individual Marines found themselves fighting hand-to-hand with German soldiers among the rocks and fallen trees. Bayonets, trench knives, and even fists were used to settle disputes that rifles and machine guns could not resolve. The fighting was primal and savage, stripping away all pretense of civilized warfare and revealing the raw courage that lay at the heart of both armies. Private William Francis, the Marine who had spent 3 days behind enemy lines, led a flanking attack that finally broke the German resistance. His intimate knowledge of the forest terrain, gained during his harrowing escape, allowed him to guide his squad through paths that the enemy had left unguarded. The surprise attack caught the Germans from behind and forced them to abandon their positions. The breakthrough came when the surviving German commanders realized that further resistance was futile. Their ammunition was running low, their communications had been severed, and their escape routes were blocked by advancing Marines. The order to retreat was given, and the remnants of the German garrison began to filter out of the wood through the few remaining gaps in the Marine lines. Major John Hughes, commanding the final assault, reported to brigade headquarters with words that would become part of Marine Corps' legend. Wood's now United States Marine Corps entirely. The simple message conveyed the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The Marines had taken a position that military experts had considered impregnable and had defeated some of the finest troops in the German army. The cost of victory had been enormous. The 4th Marine Brigade had suffered over 5,000 casualties during the 3 weeks of fighting, representing nearly 50% of their original strength. Entire companies had been reduced to squad-sized units, and many battalions existed only on paper. The wheat fields around Belleau Wood were carpeted with the bodies of young Americans who had paid the ultimate price for victory. But the Marines had proven something that would resonate throughout military history. They had demonstrated that courage, determination, and superior fighting spirit could overcome any obstacle. The techniques they had developed in the forest of Belleau would influence military tactics for generations to come, and their reputation as elite fighters would become the stuff of legend. The German soldiers who had fought against the Marines carried away a grudging respect for their opponents. They had given the Americans the nickname Teufelhunden, devil dogs, in recognition of their ferocious fighting ability. The name would be adopted by the Marines themselves and would become part of their identity for generations to come. Floyd Gibbons, despite his injuries, had continued to report from the battlefield throughout the campaign. His vivid dispatches had captured the imagination of the American public and had transformed the Marine Corps from a small naval force into a symbol of American military excellence. The name Marine would never again be associated with anything less than the highest standards of courage and professionalism. As the sun set on June 26th, the Battle of Belleau Wood was finally over. The Marines had achieved a victory that would echo through history and had established themselves as one of the world's premier fighting forces. The forest that had tested them so severely had also forged them into something new, a legend that would inspire future generations of Marines. The silence that settled over Belleau Wood on the morning of June 27th was more profound than any sound the Marines had heard in 3 weeks of combat. The forest that had echoed with gunfire, explosions, and the cries of wounded men now lay still, its ancient trees bearing witness to one of the most significant battles in American military history. The Marines who had survived the ordeal emerged from their positions like ghosts, their faces bearing the unmistakable mark of men who had looked death in the eye and refused to blink. General James Harbord walked among his men, seeing in their eyes the transformation that had taken place in the depths of the forest. These were no longer the eager young Americans who had landed in France months earlier. They had become something harder, more resilient, and infinitely more dangerous. The crucible of Belleau Wood had forged them into a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The casualty reports painted a grim picture of the price of victory. The 4th Marine Brigade had suffered 5,711 casualties out of an original strength of 8,000 men. The 5th Marines had been reduced to barely half their original numbers, while the 6th Marines had lost nearly 60% of their men. Company commanders who had started the battle leading to 100 Marines now found themselves in charge of fewer than 50 survivors. But the statistics told only part of the story. The Marines had accomplished something that military theorists had considered impossible. They had taken a fortified position defended by elite troops using tactics that had been developed on the battlefield itself. The techniques they had pioneered in the forest, small unit tactics, infiltration methods, and individual initiative, would become standard doctrine throughout the American military. Floyd Gibbons, now recovering from his wounds in a field hospital, continued to file dispatches that would shape American perception of the battle for generations to come. His colorful prose had captured the imagination of a nation hungry for heroes, and his descriptions of Marine courage under fire had elevated the Corps to a status it had never before enjoyed. The Chicago Tribune's circulation had doubled during the battle, as Americans eagerly read his accounts of their boys fighting in the French forest. The international impact of the victory was equally significant. Allied commanders, who had initially dismissed the Americans as amateurs, were forced to reassess their opinions. The German High Command, previously confident in their ability to defeat any Allied offensive, now faced the reality that a new and formidable opponent had entered the war. The psychological impact of the Marine victory resonated far beyond the boundaries of the forest itself for the French government. In recognition of the Marines' achievement, officially renamed Belleau Wood as Bois de la Brigade des Marines, Wood of the Marine Brigade, the honor was unprecedented for a foreign unit, and it symbolized the respect that the Marines had earned through their sacrifice and courage. The name would stand as a permanent reminder of American valor on French soil. The German prisoners, taken during the final days of the battle, provided valuable intelligence about enemy tactics and morale. Their interrogations revealed that the Marines had achieved something remarkable. They had broken the spirit of troops who had been considered among the finest in the German army. The prisoners spoke with grudging admiration of their opponents, acknowledging that they had never faced fighters of such tenacity and skill. The lessons learned at Belleau Wood would influence Marine Corps' doctrine for decades to come. The importance of individual initiative, the value of small unit tactics, and the necessity of adapting to battlefield conditions would become fundamental principles of Marine training. The Corps would never again be the same organization that had entered the forest 3 weeks earlier. Contemporary accounts from the Naval History magazine documented the transformation of Marine Corps' doctrine that resulted from the Belleau Wood experience. The battle had also revealed the importance of leadership at every level of the organization. Marines like Daniel Daly, John Quick, and countless others had demonstrated that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. Their examples would inspire future generations of Marines and would become part of the Corps' institutional memory. As the survivors of Belleau Wood prepared to move on to their next assignment, they carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something historic. They had proven that American fighting men could stand against the best that Europe could offer and emerge victorious. The forest that had tested them so severely had also given them something precious, the unshakable confidence that comes from having faced the ultimate test and prevailed. The Battle of Belleau Wood had ended, but its impact would resonate through history. The Marines had established themselves as elite warriors, and the world had taken notice. The small naval force that had entered the forest 3 weeks earlier had emerged as a legend that would inspire fear in enemies and pride in Americans. For generations to come, the Devil Dogs had earned their name, and the United States Marine Corps had found its identity. The forest of Belleau Wood had witnessed the birth of a military legend that would endure long after the last veteran had passed into history. The Marines had proven that some things are worth fighting for, and that courage and determination can overcome any obstacle. In the end, Belleau Wood had given the Marines something more valuable than victory. It had given them immortality.